Imagine a child's babysitter simply disappears. No trace, no justice, no answers for 25 agonizing years. We have all felt that rage when predators escape consequences, when the system fails innocent families. But what happened next defies everything you think you know about cold cases. How did a traumatized child become an unstoppable force? What dark secret was buried for decades? And why did the revenge come in a form absolutely no one saw coming? This story will shake you to your core, because sometimes justice arrives in ways that nobody expects. It was 1975 when the Miller family first met Laura Bennett. She was 23, with gentle eyes and a warm smile that could calm any crying baby. David and Susan Miller were hard-working parents who needed someone they could trust completely with their most precious possession, their 8-month-old son, Ethan. From the moment Laura walked through their front door, something magical happened. Baby Ethan stopped fussing and reached his tiny arms toward her. The Millers knew they had found someone special, but they had no idea how special Laura would become to their family, or how her disappearance would change everything. Laura wasn't just a babysitter. She became Ethan's second mother. Every morning she would arrive with a bright smile and scoop the baby into her arms. She fed him, played with him, sang him to sleep. Ethan's first word wasn't Mama or Dada. It was Lore, his attempt at saying her name. The Millers watched their son's face light up whenever Laura entered the room. She had a gift with children that couldn't be taught. But while Laura poured her heart into caring for Ethan, someone else was watching her every move. Someone who wanted something from her that she would never willingly give. Richard Hale was in his late 30s, 15 years older than Laura. He had noticed her around town and decided he wanted to marry her, not court her, not date her, marry her. Richard believed that persistence was romantic. He would show up at places where Laura worked, send flowers to her apartment, and corner her outside the grocery store. Each time, Laura politely but firmly said no. She didn't want a relationship, especially not with someone so much older, but Richard couldn't accept rejection. In his twisted mind, Laura was just playing hard to get. He began to believe that she belonged to him, and when someone believes they own another person, dangerous things happen. For 4 years, Laura continued caring for Ethan while dodging Richard's advances. The little boy grew from a baby into a curious toddler who followed Laura everywhere. He would cry when she left and run to the window to watch for her return. The bond between them was unbreakable. Laura saved every drawing Ethan made for her, every crooked flower he picked from the garden. She photographed his milestones, first steps, first bike ride, first day of preschool. To anyone watching, they looked like mother and son. But someone was watching who didn't like what he saw. Richard's obsession was growing darker by the day, and in 1979, his patience finally ran out. The night of March 15, 1979, started like any other. Laura tucked 4-year-old Ethan into bed, reading him his favorite story twice because he asked so sweetly. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Sweet dreams, little one. I'll see you tomorrow." Those would be the last words she ever spoke to him. The Millers drove Laura home, as always. They never let her walk alone at night. They watched her wave from her apartment door before driving away. But someone else was watching, too. Someone who had been planning this moment for months. Someone who couldn't stand being told no one more time. Laura never made it inside her apartment that night. As she fumbled with her keys in the dimly lit hallway, footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to see Richard and 2 other men approaching. "Laura," Richard said with a sickening smile, "we need to talk." She tried to run, but they grabbed her before she could scream. Her purse fell to the floor, keys scattering across the concrete. A neighbor later found them there, along with one of Laura's shoes. But by then, she was already gone. The next morning, when Laura didn't show up to care for Ethan, the Millers knew something was terribly wrong. Their perfect world was about to shatter. 4-year-old Ethan stood at the window, pressing his face against the glass. "Where is Laura?" he asked over and over. His parents didn't know how to answer. They called the police, filed a missing person report, organized search parties. Neighbors scoured the woods. Volunteers handed out flyers with Laura's photo. But days turned into weeks with no trace of her. Ethan stopped eating properly. He would sit by the front door for hours, waiting for Laura to walk through it. At night, he cried for her until exhaustion took over. The Millers tried to explain that Laura had gone away, but how do you tell a child that someone they love has simply vanished? How do you explain that monsters are real? The police investigation hit dead ends quickly. They questioned Richard Hale. His name came up from several people who mentioned his pursuit of Laura. But Richard had an alibi. He claimed he was at a bar with friends that night. The friends backed up his story. With no physical evidence and no witnesses to the actual disappearance, the case went cold within months. The detective assigned to Laura's case retired 2 years later, taking his theories with him. The file was packed away in a storage room, gathering dust alongside hundreds of other unsolved mysteries. But for little Ethan Miller, there was no moving on. The absence of Laura left a hole in his heart that would never heal. As Ethan grew older, his memories of Laura became more precious and painful. He kept the last photo they took together, him sitting on her lap, both of them laughing at something silly he had said. His parents tried to help him move forward, but Ethan couldn't let go. He would lie awake at night wondering what happened to her. Did she suffer? Was she calling for help? Was she thinking of him? These questions tortured him through childhood and into his teenage years. Other kids his age worried about homework and dating. Ethan Miller was haunted by the ghost of a woman who had vanished when he was just 4 years old. But that haunting was shaping him in ways nobody could imagine. By high school, Ethan had made a decision that would define his entire life. He was going to find out what happened to Laura Bennett. Not someday, not maybe, definitely. He threw himself into studying criminal justice, forensic science, anything that might help him solve cold cases. His grades were perfect because he had a purpose bigger than himself. While other teenagers were at parties, Ethan was reading about investigation techniques. His parents worried he was obsessing, but they couldn't shake him from his path. The boy who had lost his second mother was becoming a man with a mission, and that mission had a name: justice for Laura Bennett. Ethan graduated top of his class and immediately enrolled in the police academy. His instructors had never seen such dedication in a recruit. He studied harder, trained longer, and asked more questions than anyone else. When asked why he wanted to become a criminal investigator, Ethan would simply say, "Some people deserve justice, even when everyone else has given up on them." He specialized in cold cases, learning every technique for solving crimes that had gone unsolved for years. His fellow officers respected his skills, but wondered about the intensity in his eyes whenever he talked about missing persons. They didn't know they were looking at a man with a very personal mission. Detective Ethan Miller got his badge in 2001, 22 years after Laura's disappearance. His first request was access to all cold case files from the late 1970s. His supervisor raised an eyebrow, but granted permission. That night, Ethan sat in his small apartment with boxes of forgotten cases spread across his floor. Missing persons, unsolved murders, abandoned investigations, dozens of families who never got answers. But there was only one file that mattered to him. When he opened Laura Bennett's case folder, his hands were shaking. Inside were photos of the crime scene, witness statements, and a single note from the lead detective. Suspect Richard Hale. Insufficient evidence to prosecute. Ethan stared at that name for a long time. After all these years, he finally had somewhere to start. The original investigation had been thorough but limited by 1970s technology. No DNA testing, no cell phone records, no security cameras. Just old-fashioned detective work and witness statements. Ethan read every page 3 times, memorizing details that might have been overlooked. Laura's landlord mentioned seeing a fancy car parked outside the building several times in the weeks before her disappearance. A bartender remembered Richard Hale being unusually sweaty and nervous the night he claimed to have an alibi. These were breadcrumbs that the original investigators couldn't follow with the tools they had. But Ethan Miller had something they didn't: modern technology and an unbreakable determination to find the truth. The hunt for Richard Hale was about to begin. Finding Richard Hale proved easier than expected. He was still alive, now in his 60s, living in a different part of the country under his own name. He had never been charged with any crime related to Laura's disappearance, so he felt safe. Ethan spent weeks studying Richard's life, his job history, his marriages and divorces, his habits. What he found painted a picture of a controlling man who couldn't handle rejection. Richard had been married 3 times. Each wife had filed for divorce, citing emotional abuse and possessive behavior. He had restraining orders from 2 other women he had stalked. The pattern was clear, but patterns don't prove murder. Ethan needed more than suspicion. He needed evidence. Ethan's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing Richard's employment records, he discovered that Richard had worked construction in 1979. More importantly, his company had been building a new housing development on the outskirts of town right around the time Laura disappeared. Construction sites were perfect places to hide bodies: deep foundations, heavy machinery to move earth, and legitimate reasons for disturbed soil. Ethan felt his heart racing as he realized what this might mean. If Richard had killed Laura, he would have needed somewhere to dispose of her body quickly and permanently. A construction site where he worked would have been perfect. But proving this theory would require something that hadn't existed 25 years ago. Modern ground-penetrating radar could find buried objects that had been hidden for decades. Ethan convinced his department to let him bring a team to the old construction site, now a quiet residential neighborhood. The homeowners were confused but cooperative when police asked to scan their yards with strange-looking equipment. For 3 days, the radar found nothing unusual. Ethan began to doubt his theory, and maybe he was chasing ghosts. Maybe his childhood trauma was making him see connections that weren't there. But on the 4th day, in the backyard of a house built in late 1979, the radar detected something that made Ethan's blood run cold. There was definitely something buried there that didn't belong. The excavation began at dawn on a cold October morning in 2004. Ethan watched as careful workers slowly removed layers of earth, following precise grids to preserve any evidence they might find. 3 feet down, they hit something that wasn't soil, a piece of faded fabric, then more fabric, then something that made the experienced crime scene investigators step back in respectful silence. After 25 years, Laura Bennett had been found. She was wrapped in an old blanket, her skeletal remains still wearing the jewelry the Millers remembered from the night she disappeared. Ethan had to step away from the excavation site to compose himself. The little boy inside him was crying for his lost Laura, but the detective in him was already planning his next move. The forensic examination confirmed what Ethan already knew in his heart. The remains were definitely Laura Bennett, identified by dental records and personal items found with the body. But more importantly, there was evidence of trauma, fractures to the skull that indicated she had been murdered. The medical examiner estimated she had been dead since approximately 1979. Everything pointed to Richard Hale, but pointing and proving were different things. Ethan needed a confession or witnesses who could place Richard at the scene. After 25 years, that seemed impossible. Most witnesses were dead or had forgotten details from so long ago. But Ethan had learned something important during his years as a detective. Guilty people often want to confess. They carry the weight of their crimes like stones in their hearts. Ethan made a decision that would have gotten him fired if his superiors had known about it. He was going to confront Richard Hale directly, not as Detective Miller, but as the boy who had lost his Laura. He drove to Richard's house on a Saturday morning when he knew Richard would be home alone. The man who answered the door was older, grayer, but still had the same cold eyes that witnesses had described 25 years ago. "Richard Hale?" Ethan asked. "I'd like to talk to you about Laura Bennett." Richard's face went pale, but he invited Ethan inside. In the living room of a killer's house, the final confrontation was about to begin. "I don't know why you're asking about her," Richard said, but his hands were shaking as he poured himself a drink. That was a long time ago. Ethan sat across from him, studying the man's face for tells. 25 years of guilt had taken their toll. Richard looked older than his years, with deep lines around his eyes and a nervous twitch when he spoke. "We found her, Richard," Ethan said quietly. "We found Laura's body." The glass slipped from Richard's hands, shattering on the floor. He stared at Ethan with the look of a man whose worst nightmare had just come true. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, but his voice cracked on every word. Ethan had interviewed hundreds of suspects during his career. He knew how to read guilt, fear, and deception. Richard Hale was drowning in all three. "She was buried at the construction site where you worked," Ethan continued. "The same site where your company was pouring foundations in March 1979. The same month Laura disappeared." Richard's breathing became shallow and rapid. He was having a panic attack, his body betraying the secrets his mind had kept locked away for decades. "You need to leave," Richard gasped. "I want you to leave right now." But Ethan wasn't going anywhere. He had waited 25 years for this moment. The little boy who cried for Laura was finally going to get his answers. "Do you know what it's like to lose someone you love when you're 4 years old?" Ethan asked. His voice was steady, but Richard could see the pain in his eyes. "Do you know what it's like to spend your whole life wondering what happened to them? Laura was more than my babysitter. She was like a mother to me, and you took her away." Richard's face crumpled as the weight of 25 years came crashing down. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered. "I just wanted her to listen to me. I just wanted her to understand that we belong together." The confession was beginning to spill out like poison from an infected wound. Ethan pulled out his phone to record, his hands surprisingly steady. "She wouldn't listen," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "I tried to explain that I loved her, that I could take care of her, but she kept saying no. She kept trying to get away from me." Tears were streaming down the old man's face as he relived that night 25 years ago. "I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted her to understand. But she was screaming and fighting, and—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan felt sick, but he needed to hear everything. "What happened, Richard? Tell me exactly what happened to Laura that night." The man who had destroyed so many lives was finally ready to tell the truth. But the truth was even darker than Ethan had imagined. "We grabbed her outside her apartment," Richard said. "My brother helped me. We just wanted to take her somewhere quiet where we could talk. But she was so scared, so angry. She said she would never love me, that I disgusted her. She said—" Richard's voice broke completely. "She said she would rather die than be with me." Ethan's blood turned to ice. Those were fighting words to a man who couldn't handle rejection. "I hit her," Richard whispered. "I didn't mean to hit her so hard, but she wouldn't stop screaming. She fell and hit her head on a rock. There was so much blood." The room fell silent except for Richard's sobbing and the sound of Ethan's recording device capturing every word. "She was still breathing," Richard continued, his voice barely audible. "But she was unconscious. My brother said we had to take her to a hospital, but I knew they would ask questions. I knew everyone would find out what I had done, so I—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Ethan felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What did you do, Richard?" The old man looked up with tears streaming down his face. "I smothered her with my jacket. She never woke up. She never knew what was happening. I told myself it was merciful, that she wasn't suffering, but I know what I really did. I killed the most beautiful person I ever met because I couldn't have her." The confession continued for 2 more hours. Richard told Ethan about burying Laura's body at the construction site in the middle of the night, about lying to police during the investigation, about the nightmares that had haunted him for 25 years. He had moved across the country to escape the memories, but they followed him everywhere. Every woman he met looked like Laura in some small way. Every relationship failed because he saw her ghost in everyone else. "I've been dead inside since that night," Richard whispered. "I killed her, and I killed myself too. I just didn't have the courage to finish the job." By the time he finished talking, Ethan had enough evidence to put Richard Hale away for the rest of his life. Ethan called for backup, and Richard Hale was arrested without resistance. The old man seemed relieved that his secret was finally out. As they put handcuffs on him, he looked at Ethan with hollow eyes. "Are you really that baby boy she used to take care of?" Richard asked. "She talked about you all the time, said you were the sweetest child she had ever met. She loved you like you were her own son." Those words hit Ethan harder than anything else in the confession. Even in her final moments, Laura had been thinking about him. The woman who had shaped his entire life had carried his memory to her grave. Richard Hale would spend his remaining years in prison, but for Ethan, the real work was just beginning. The news of Richard Hale's arrest and confession made headlines across the country. "Cold case solved after 25 years," read the morning papers. But for Ethan, this wasn't about headlines or career advancement. This was about keeping a promise he had made to a woman who couldn't hear him anymore. Laura Bennett's remains were released to her family for burial. Her parents, now elderly and frail, had never stopped hoping for answers. They wept when Ethan told them about the arrest, but they also thanked him for never giving up. "Laura would be so proud of the man you became," her mother said through tears. "She always said you were special." The funeral was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in autumn, 25 years too late. Ethan stood at Laura's graveside as her casket was lowered into the earth. The service was small. Her surviving family members, the Millers, and a few officers from Ethan's department. He placed a single white rose on the casket, along with something else, that last photograph of himself as a 4-year-old sitting on Laura's lap. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I found the truth. I found justice. I hope you can rest now." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves on nearby trees, and for just a moment Ethan could swear he heard Laura's voice saying, "Thank you, little one." The boy who had lost his second mother had become the man who brought her home. The trial of Richard Hale was swift and decisive. With his recorded confession and the physical evidence from the burial site, the prosecution had an airtight case. Richard's defense attorney argued for a reduced sentence based on his client's age and his voluntary confession, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. "You stole 25 years of closure from Laura Bennett's family," the judge said during sentencing. "You stole 25 years of justice from the community, and you stole 25 years of peace from a little boy who loved the victim like a mother." Richard Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 64 years old, he would die behind bars. But for Ethan, the sentence felt like an ending and a beginning. After the trial, Ethan returned to his work as a cold case detective with renewed purpose. Laura's case had taught him that no mystery was truly unsolvable if someone cared enough to keep digging. He started taking on the oldest, most hopeless cases in the department's files. Missing persons from the 1960s and 70s, murders that had stumped investigators for decades, families who had given up hope of ever getting answers. Ethan's success rate became legendary among his colleagues. Other officers started calling him the Closer because he solved cases that everyone else had written off as impossible. But Ethan knew the truth. He wasn't unusually gifted. He was just a man who understood what it felt like to live without closure. 3 years after Richard Hale's conviction, Ethan received a letter that changed everything. It was from Richard himself, written from his prison cell. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," the letter began, "but there are things I never told you. Things about what happened to Laura that you deserve to know. Ethan's hands were shaking as he read. Richard claimed that Laura's last words weren't about herself. They were about Ethan. "She said to tell the little boy that she loved him," Richard wrote. "She said to tell him that he was the best thing in her life. I never told anyone because I couldn't bear to think about the good person I had destroyed. But you deserve to know that her final thoughts were of you." Ethan drove to the prison that weekend. He sat across from Richard Hale in a sterile visiting room separated by thick glass. The man looked even older than his years, broken by guilt and isolation. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ethan asked. Richard's eyes were filled with tears. "Because I'm dying," he said quietly. "Cancer. I have maybe 6 months left. And I realized that carrying her last message was the only decent thing I could still do." He leaned forward, pressing his palm against the glass. "She loved you like her own child. In all my years of obsessing over her, I never understood that her capacity for love was what made her special. I destroyed that love, but I can't destroy the memory of it. Promise me you'll remember that she loved you." Richard Hale died in prison 4 months later. Ethan didn't attend the funeral. There wasn't one. The man who had stolen so much from so many people left the world as alone as he had lived it. But his final revelation had given Ethan something precious, the knowledge that Laura's last thoughts had been of love, not fear, that she had died thinking of the little boy who meant everything to her. Ethan visited Laura's grave and shared the news with her headstone. "He told me what you said," Ethan whispered. "Thank you for loving me. Thank you for making me who I am. Thank you for giving me purpose." The autumn wind stirred the flowers on her grave, and Ethan felt a peace he hadn't experienced in 25 years. Ethan's success with cold cases caught the attention of television producers who wanted to feature his work on a crime documentary series. The episode about Laura Bennett's case aired on a Tuesday night and drew millions of viewers. But the most important viewer was someone Ethan never expected to hear from. The next morning his phone rang at the police station. "Detective Miller?" said a woman's voice. "My name is Sarah Chen, and I think you solved my sister's murder. She disappeared in 1982, and after watching your show last night, I think the same man who killed Laura Bennett might have killed her too." Ethan felt his blood run cold. Richard Hale had been in prison since 2004, but he had lived freely for 25 years after murdering Laura. How many other victims might there be? Sarah Chen's sister, Amy, had disappeared from a shopping mall parking lot in 1982. She was 21, worked as a nurse, and had recently rejected marriage proposals from an older co-worker named Robert Hayes. The similarities to Laura's case were impossible to ignore. Young woman, older male pursuer, sudden disappearance after rejection. Ethan asked Sarah to fax him everything she had about Amy's case. When the pages came through, one detail jumped off the page. Robert Hayes had worked construction in the early 1980s, just like Richard Hale. And according to employment records that Sarah had somehow obtained, Robert Hayes and Richard Hale had worked for the same company. They weren't just similar killers, they had been accomplices. The investigation into Amy Chen's disappearance led Ethan down a rabbit hole that would consume the next 2 years of his life. Richard Hale and Robert Hayes had been friends who shared a twisted view of women and relationships. They had helped each other stalk, kidnap, and murder women who rejected their advances. Police records showed that Robert Hayes had been questioned in connection with Amy's disappearance, but had provided an alibi. He claimed he was with Richard Hale that night. Now Ethan understood that they had been covering for each other, providing false alibis for their crimes. The construction company they worked for had built developments all across 3 states. If they had been killing together, there could be dozens of victims buried at job sites stretching back decades. Robert Hayes was still alive, now 72 years old, and living in a retirement community. Unlike Richard, he had never confessed to anything and maintained his innocence even when confronted with evidence. But Ethan had learned from his experience with Richard Hale. Guilty men eventually break under pressure. He began visiting Robert regularly, not as an interrogator, but as someone seeking truth. "I know you were Richard's friend," Ethan would say. "I know you cared about him. He told me about the guilt he carried for all those years. Don't you think it's time to let go of that burden?" It took 8 months of weekly visits, but Robert Hayes finally cracked. The confessions he made would shake the law enforcement community to its core. Robert Hayes confessed to participating in the murders of 11 women between 1978 and 1985. All were young, all had rejected romantic advances from older men, and all were buried at construction sites where Robert and Richard had worked. The two men had developed a system. They would identify targets, stalk them for weeks, then kidnap and murder them when the opportunity arose. They saw themselves as collectors, taking women who had wounded their pride and making them pay the ultimate price. "We thought we were teaching them lessons," Robert said during one recorded confession. "We thought we were showing them what happened to women who thought they were too good for men like us." The depth of their evil was almost incomprehensible to Ethan, but it explained so much about the randomness of their crimes. The task of finding all 11 victims became the largest cold case investigation in the department's history. Ethan led a team of detectives, forensic experts, and volunteers in searching former construction sites across 3 states. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and careful excavation revealed grave after grave. Each discovery brought closure to families who had waited decades for answers, but it also revealed the true scope of Richard and Robert's killing spree. Sarah Chen wept when they found her sister Amy buried beneath what was now a suburban playground. Other families gathered at excavation sites, holding photos of daughters and sisters who had been lost for so long. Ethan watched these reunions with mixed emotions. Joy for the families getting answers, but rage at how many lives had been destroyed by 2 sick men. By the time all 11 bodies were recovered, Robert Hayes was dying of emphysema in a prison medical facility. Like his partner Richard, he seemed relieved that his secrets were finally out. In his final interview with Ethan, Robert made a statement that would haunt the detective forever. "You want to know the truth about us?" Robert wheezed. "We were cowards. We killed those women because we couldn't handle being told no. We destroyed families because our egos were more important than human life. Richard and I weren't monsters. We were pathetic little boys who never learned how to deal with rejection." Robert Hayes died 2 weeks later, taking with him any remaining secrets about their crimes. But his confession had given closure to 11 families who had never stopped hoping for the truth. The media called it the construction site serial murders and declared Ethan Miller a hero for solving 11 cold cases. But Ethan didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had accidentally stumbled into his life's purpose. The little boy who had lost Laura Bennett had become the man who brought justice to 11 other families. It was a calling he had never asked for, but couldn't abandon. At the memorial service for all 11 victims, Ethan spoke about the importance of never giving up on the missing. These women were daughters, sisters, friends. They mattered, their lives had value, and their families deserved to know the truth, no matter how long it took. Standing in that crowd, surrounded by grateful families, Ethan finally understood why he had survived Laura's loss, so he could help others survive theirs. Ethan's work on the construction site serial murders made him nationally famous, but fame wasn't what he wanted. He turned down book deals and movie offers, choosing instead to focus on what mattered most, solving cold cases for families who had given up hope. His department created a special cold case unit with Ethan as its leader. They tackled the oldest, most complicated cases, using modern technology and old-fashioned detective work to solve crimes that had stumped investigators for generations. Ethan's team developed new techniques for finding burial sites, analyzing decades-old evidence, and interviewing elderly witnesses. Their success rate was unprecedented, but Ethan knew that every solved case represented years of anguish for families who had waited too long for answers. 10 years after Richard Hale's arrest, Ethan received a package with no return address. Inside was a child's drawing, a stick figure woman holding hands with a smaller stick figure. At the bottom, in crayon, someone had written, "Laura and Ethan forever." The package also contained a note. "Dear Detective Miller, my grandmother was one of the 11 women you found. She was killed when my mom was just 5 years old. My mom never stopped talking about her, and because of you, we were finally able to bury her properly. This is a picture my mom drew of her and her mother when she was little. She wanted you to have it, because she says you understand what it's like to lose someone you love. Thank you for bringing our family peace." Ethan hung the drawing in his office, next to the photo of himself and Laura from all those years ago. As Ethan approached his 50th birthday, he realized that his entire adult life had been shaped by one terrible night in 1979. But unlike Richard Hale and Robert Hayes, who had let their trauma turn them into monsters, Ethan had channeled his pain into something meaningful. He had become a voice for the voiceless, a champion for families who had nowhere else to turn. His cold case unit had solved over 200 cases, bringing closure to families across the country. Each solved case was a small victory against the darkness that men like Richard and Robert had tried to spread. But Ethan knew that his most important case would always be his first: the disappearance of Laura Bennett and the little boy's promise to find the truth. On the 25th anniversary of solving Laura's case, Ethan visited her grave one final time as an active detective. He was retiring from the force, but not from his mission. He planned to start a nonprofit organization that would help families navigate cold case investigations, providing resources and support that hadn't existed when the Millers were searching for Laura. "I learned something important from you," Ethan said to Laura's headstone. "Love doesn't die when people do, it just changes form. Your love for me became my love for justice. Your care for one child became my care for hundreds of families. You're still taking care of people, Laura. You're still making the world a better place." The wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in that sound, Ethan heard the echo of a woman's voice saying, "Thank you, little one," one last time. Ethan's nonprofit organization, called the Laura Bennett Foundation, became a national resource for families of missing persons. They provided emotional support, investigative resources, and advocacy for cold case reviews. The foundation's motto was simple: no one is ever truly lost if someone refuses to stop looking. Ethan trained volunteers across the country in cold case investigation techniques, teaching them how to pressure police departments to reopen old cases and how to use modern technology to solve decades-old mysteries. The foundation solved its first case within 6 months: a missing teenager from 1995 whose body was found using techniques that Ethan had developed while searching for the construction site serial murder victims. Her family had waited 27 years for answers. Now they had them, and they had closure. As news of Ethan's work spread around the world, he began receiving letters from families in other countries who were dealing with missing persons cases. The pain was universal: parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, siblings who had lost each other, but so was hope. Ethan's story proved that even the coldest cases could be solved with enough determination and the right approach. He started training international law enforcement agencies in his techniques, helping to solve missing persons cases on every continent. The little boy who had cried for his missing babysitter had become a beacon of hope for grieving families everywhere. His mission had grown far beyond what he ever imagined possible. Today, 30 years after Laura Bennett's murder was solved, Detective Ethan Miller's legacy lives on through hundreds of solved cases and thousands of families who finally have answers. But the most important lesson of his story isn't about investigative techniques or criminal justice. It's about the power of love to survive death and transform pain into purpose. A 4-year-old boy's love for his babysitter became a man's dedication to justice. A woman's final thoughts of the child she cared for became the foundation for a lifetime of helping others. Richard Hale and Robert Hayes thought they could destroy love through violence, but they were wrong. Love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow. And sometimes that growth takes forms that no one expects, bringing justice where there was none, and hope where there was only despair. The question that haunts us all is this: what would you do if someone you loved simply vanished, and how far would you go to find the truth? This shocking revenge story shows us how real-life mysteries can haunt families for decades, turning missing person cases into lifelong quests for justice. Like the most satisfying revenge stories ever told, this tale proves that cold case investigations never truly die when someone refuses to give up. True crime documentaries often feature disappeared persons who vanished without a trace, but few capture the epic transformation from victim to avenger quite like this. The best revenge stories in history teach us that justice can take unexpected forms, sometimes through the very children left behind when someone mysteriously disappears. This suspenseful missing person story joins the ranks of famous revenge cases where cold revenge becomes the ultimate resolution. From vanishing persons mysteries to brutal revenge tales, these real-life disappearance stories remind us that some mysteries are solved not by luck, but by love, transformed into unstoppable determination. What makes this one of the top revenge stories with unexpected endings is how a babysitter's disappearance became a detective's calling, proving that the most powerful true stories of missing persons often begin with the smallest victims who grow into the greatest champions of justice.